Coogs House. Of course, just as the Houston Cougars are entering the Power 5 conferences, the entire landscape of college sports changes.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Coogs, the daily podcast all about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, to break down all things Cougs. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to step by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. If you want to join the conversation but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below where on your teeth you start when you brush your teeth. A lot of people don't think about this, but there's like a distinct spot you go to. Anyway, tell us what it is down below. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. More on that in a minute, but everything you know about college sports changed, or at least is in the process of changing after Thursday. I want to talk some about what could come out of this, if there's any movement in this. I want to talk some about the potential bad things that could come out of this for Houston. Uh, I think there are some, and just trying to read between lines on some of this stuff. But first and foremost, let's talk about what's happening and what's good about it for Houston. So if you did not catch the news yesterday, and admittedly there were NHL and NBA playoffs and baseball starting up and all of that, right? I guess baseball is more than just starting up at this point, but I digress. What you've really got here is a large, gigantic settlement being reached in college athletics. So all five power conferences, because we're still operating under the 23-24 school year, there are five power conferences. All five power conferences have voted to agree to a settlement with the NCAA over the ability, at its simplest form, the ability to compensate athletes, what compensation for athletes would be. Now, the next step would be judge approving of that settlement, hearings about it, and so on. So we're not done with it yet. It's not like kids are getting paid on, the Tuesday after Memorial Day or whatever, right? But it is interesting to see this gigantic cultural shift in looking at pro sports versus college sports and amateurism and what those words definitionally mean. I think what's really interesting is it's 2024, and in 2014 you had the O'Bannon case, O'Bannon versus the NCAA, largely about video games, right? And like, hey, we deserve to get paid for our likeness and that or whatever. And you had schools and schools like high ups at schools, representatives of schools, state schools, and the politicians making legitimate arguments that people would suddenly stop watching college sports if the kids got paid. And today in 2024, all of those same people, the politicians, the high ups at the administrative level, the coaches, they're all saying, no, we should do this. Now, I should point out this is an antitrust case, and the argument was that there was an unfair way of treating labor here, all this work being done, the school profiting and not paying the employees, right? And I think the moving forward, what those words definitionally mean. I said definitionally twice already in the first 5 minutes. I think someone won bingo just now. But what do these five conferences view their athletes as, and what kind of employment status is it, and all of those layers to things are all still getting ironed out, right? The level of how much can they collectively bargain, right, as a workforce. All of that is not set in stone in this case. That's not how it's not like laying out a point by point, play by play on how to do that. I do think, though, in this first segment, we need to mention that this helps Houston. What they're doing here is looking at revenue, and the settlement has both a backward, looking back at what could have been earned, looking forward and paying that out over the course of time, and essentially is allotting each institution at the Power 5 level, and yes, it is including Washington State and Oregon State. It includes all five conferences. But it's looking at how can they allocate roughly $20 to $22 million per school to pay athletes. Now, I think there's some people arguing against these kinds of measures because of the academic workload and the this and the that and the job and those kinds of things. But I think it's, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at college campuses and see how much that academic workload has already been shifted for these guys, right? These kids, I should say, the college kids, because truthfully, they're, picking majors that can line up with their athletic schedules a lot of the time. Some take online classes, or a bulk of, if not all of, online classes to be able to work around the demanding schedule of a Division I, Power Five college athletes. I think that the academic piece of this being, air quotes, altered is kind of a sunk cost with the way things are, the kind of work the kids are being asked at a minimum required to do, right? And that's, that's not to say there's anything wrong with the online education. Totally fine. There's not saying there's anything wrong with, maybe not or there's any like bad majors or what have you, right? It's just that like that is the reality, that those changes already happened. The only change they're adding is saying now you've got to divvy up this $20 to $22 million amongst your student athletes for how they've helped your university. I think this is a good thing for Houston because it's putting a cap on it. In November 2023, it was reported by a number of outlets that Houston's football program, every football program is the big moneymaker at the vast majority of these schools, right? Like all but like 4 or 5. The Houston Cougars football program in 2022 had the lowest revenue of any Power 5 school in the 2023 school year. And it wasn't particularly close. I should also point out before people jump on my back and say, well, the Big 12 TV money hadn't kicked in yet. Some of the other schools that were down there well ahead of Houston also did not have that Big 12 TV money. And you got to think that they would move up the same amount, right? But in a world where that could mean that the Houston Cougars turn into, I don't know, insert like the 2014 Astros, or like these old teams that have a bunch of young players to ultimately watch transfer out and leave later. Think about glorified farm system kind of pro teams in baseball. You're looking at, if you don't have these regulations, something like baseball with like the Yankees having 27 World Series is because their payroll seems infinite. The Dodgers going getting anyone they want, or for terms of more success, you could look at like La Liga in soccer in Spain, and like how there's a whole league, but really only 2 teams have a chance of winning it, and that's either Barcelona or Madrid, right? If there were no regulations in college sports and the way that they're going to look to compensate college athletes, there's nothing keeping that from happening, right? You would just have Georgia, Alabama. You might have the way we've seen Missouri and Indiana really invest in their NIL programs. I know BYU's done particularly well, right? You might have those kinds of things pop up. But by and large, this would just become the wealthiest programs, the wealthiest teams got better, right? And that's not sports. It's not what we want to see. When people talk about overly professionalizing sports, I think that's what they actually mean, right? They want more parity. When we look at like leagues with parity, the NBA is looking at their 6th different champion in a row, right? The NFL seems to have, I know that the Chiefs just won 2 in a row, but the NFL seems to have different, there's always a team that goes from 4th in their division to the 1st in their division and back and forth, and all kinds of movement in that league. Those leagues have salary caps, and the salary caps help keep things even, keep things where everyone's competing in the same playing field, I guess basketball court. But in doing that, what you're doing is making sure there's no competitive advantage just because of pay, right? The Cowboys, the Lakers, they can't just get anyone they want because they make a lot of money, right? There are other reasons those programs have typically gotten stars, but it's not just because there's some amount of money. If anything, it's they're getting the same money there they'd get most other places, right? And I think that helps Houston, because when you combine that with the fact that Houston is bringing in less money than most Power 5 programs at this point, we're still building, pessimist. We're growing it, right? It's not that it's never going to happen, but we're still growing the programs, right? And in still growing the programs, what that means is we're going to have time to play catch up here while this cap of sorts is functionally in place. Because truthfully, what you're seeing is that is a cap, or that is an allotment that hurts these bigger institutions, right? That Alabama could only pay their guys $22 million. Ohio State could only pay, or Michigan could only pay, is different than Houston gets to pay, right? And I think that's where it really helps Houston to be in the same ballpark. We're competitive with the Power Five. We're gonna be able to pay our athletes, etc. But we're going to pay them from the same kind of pool that any other school can, right? That helps us in a big way. Now, I don't think this is all roses and dandelions. I think there are some things to keep an eye on that might not work out so well. But first, if things are working out well for you these days and you're feeling particularly like you're just on a good string and the playoffs are going on and you want to keep the winning going, you got to go check out FanDuel, because right now it's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL. And FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets to any winning $5 bets, $150 for point spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/locked-on and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, guys. So when I look at FanDuel, I really am paying a lot of extra attention right now to things like the Western Conference Finals, Eastern Conference Finals. I'm riding with Jarris and the Pacers. I think they got a shot. Halliburton just went down, though, so maybe that's spent money. Anyway, digressing. I look at the case as it's setting up and look at the way this ruling, because we don't have the settlement in front of us, right? The settlement's not published. What we have is published opinions by a bunch of writers who have talked to people who have read or written the settlement. And so this is like third or fourth hand knowledge in the game of telephone. Frankly, I've read like 12 or 13 things in the last 4 hours on this. And so when I say I can't even think about like what point to cite to whom. So to the authors of those, I'm sorry. There were several good places to read this kind of stuff from. But I think there's some interesting points being raised about the negative side of the settlement, even for a school like Houston. Like I said, I think Houston benefits from the idea of a cap here, right? But the revenue split here, based on numbers being thrown around, is pretty poor. For reference, in the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, the MLS, even NHL, revenue split is generally around 50-50, meaning all revenues, half goes to players, half goes to, for lack of a better phrase, the teams, right? The owners. And the owners distribute that amongst their staff, right? And people that work for them. That means that 50 cents on every dollar goes to the people playing the games. For different leagues, always has different amounts of dollars. The NFL has a lot more dollars. The NBA has a lot less people, or whatever, right? What you're looking at here is a revenue split closer to 22. It's like 21 and change, 22-78, meaning about 22% of the revenues are going to the athletes. That's really bad. That's really low. It's legitimately so low that it's like comparable to when women's soccer, the American women's soccer program, national women's national team took God. That's after reading 4 hours of this stuff. Took their case to higher courts, ultimately arguing for the same revenue split as their male counterparts, right? Because they thought that as a popular program in states, if they could get the same percentage, they'd make a lot more money, right? When people clown on the WNBA salaries, one of the constant rebuttals back from WNBA advocates or WNBA people talking about the growth of the league is their salaries are low because they make about 20 cents on the dollar. About 20% of revenues go to the entirety of the players, as opposed to the 50-50 split that other leagues have. right? And I don't mean to reference to belittle other pro sports endeavors, but I do think it's worth pointing out that this is low. If this is really down on the 21% or 21 and change percent of the revenues going to players, that's really low. And there are a lot of college athletes, and they'll use Title IX as a mask to cover some of this. I'm not going to sit here and say that Title IX is a problem, but what they're going to argue, right? The argument that's going to be made is that because of Title IX, right, they're going to keep the revenues going back to student athletes low as a way to make sure that it's evenly distributed across both male and female sports in college athletics. And further, that's going to be like their argument to keep it to the low revenue number it is. And then the schools, administrations, coaches, administrators, they're all going to continue to line pockets. Now, I'm not saying those people don't work hard for the money, and I get there's some perk to being the AD, some perk to being his assistant, his or her assistant. There's some perk to being the head football coach, etc. But what this is doing is putting those caps on revenues and keeping that money from the kids, and using some arguments that seem in bad faith, to say the least, to work around that. I think the interesting thing in looking at this is Olympic sports, right? The interesting thing about Olympic sports is that in most other countries, people between the ages of 17 and 24, which includes, a large chunk of that would be these college age kids, right? That 17 to 24 group in most other countries that compete in Olympic sports are bluntly paid by the government. Their governments fund their careers at that age, right? And the American model to this point has been, no, but like you get a scholarship to Houston, right? Like you get to go do it in school, right? You get to wrestle or whatever your sport of choice is, your Olympic sport. And you still get high quality coaching. And frankly, it's worked out. The United States does very well in the Olympics every, 2 years, right? And what that means, whether it's summer or winter, right? What that means is that the U.S. government has gotten to dodge paying those athletes where other countries since 92 have. That's just the way it's worked out, right? And I don't mean to be political and say these politicians, since 92 is a long time. A lot of different politicians have come through, and a lot of different things could have changed and never have, right? The idea is that other countries are seeing their government fund, because they compete for their flag, these athletes in a way that American systems are not set up that way. Instead, their payment now is going to come from this same revenue, because they're training, they're competing, and frankly, they're developing under the guise of these colleges instead of competing for America. And thus, the colleges are going to be the ones in charge of compensating, right? I doubt we get to anything where Team USA, using American tax dollars, gets funneled into things like Olympic weightlifting, things like downhill skiing. I don't see this becoming the kind of thing where college age kids are getting paid from the U.S. government instead of their schools. I think that they're going to try and use that blanket as much as they can. But I will say one thing that could make this drag on, and that's going to get to the last point about why this could be working backwards. One of the things that could make this drag on is that, again, regardless of politics, actually kind of one of the only bipartisan things that's happened the last feels like 20 years, is that everyone hates the NCAA, right? Like the Supreme Court in 2021, very divisive time, coming off of elections and things like that. Divisive, right? The Supreme Court unanimously ruled against the NCAA and allowed for things like name, image, and likeness, right? Like the NCAA is constantly, no matter what side of the aisle you stand on, the NCAA is the bad guy, period. Full stop. It's either keeping the free market from happening, or it's keeping these athletes from, making their work, their worth as laborers, whatever end of the spectrum you stand on, the NCAA is in your way. And I think that means we got a lot more court cases. House is not the last. It's not the first. It's not the last. And I don't know what happens to college sports in the interim, between whether it's Houston or whomever, between ultimately kind of working through all these to get whatever model we're heading towards, which is some sort of a traditional minor league or payment model. At some point, all of these court cases will only delay that, though. And that's, I think, a problem, because at some point you're delaying the inevitable, and college kids have very short careers, and it's very much a finite window. I mean, how many kids? I mean, Jamal Shedd is going to the NBA draft now, and he's going to make NBA money. But how many kids in the last 4 or 5 years have missed out on these payments that are now going to come as a result of House versus NCAA? Right? Like every 3-4 years, you spent another generation's careers as far as college sports goes, right? And the longer this takes, the more athletes you add to the list of people that, again, whatever side of the aisle you stand on, have been done wrong, right? In my last bit, I want to talk some about the idea of the toothpaste and the tube, and how all this has already come out. Is it ever what the direction is that this goes? Does it ever change or not? But in the meantime, if you are trying to get to a conference finals matchup, if you are trying to get to a comedy show, if you're trying to get to the Astros, if you're trying to get to whatever your local baseball team is, you need to get the best deal on tickets to make sure you're maximizing your experience. The best place to do that is the Game Time app. Right now, they got all kinds of different deals for you. You got last minute deals and flash deals. That means as you get closer to the event, whether it's, again, comedy, theater, music, sports, whatever, as you get closer to the event, the tickets get cheaper. All kinds of zone deals. You can choose a section, let Game Time do the rest. People on average will save about 18% on that. They got seat views where, like, you can say, okay, I'm watching this type of an event at this venue from this section and this row, and they'll give you what it looks like for that event at that venue from your seat. All kinds of great things, but you got to click here for the summertime because they've got the lowest price guarantee. Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. You can find tickets the same row and section for a different price. So make sure you go check them out today. Game Time is the best place and the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your ticketing purchase. So make sure you go check out Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, so when I talk about toothpaste coming out of the tube here, what I'm saying is, frankly, I told you guys I teach. I say that every day. When I taught 5th grade, there's a lesson, right? Where you give every kid a little travel size bottle of toothpaste and a napkin. And you say, okay, what I want you to do, we're going to give away a Jolly Rancher. Who can get the most toothpaste out of this tube? Now squeeze it and roll it, then they roll it all out, and the toothpaste all comes out. And then at the end, you give out the Jolly Rancher or whatever. Say, okay, I will give out 10 Jolly Ranchers to anyone who can get all of that toothpaste back into their tube. And the kids just look dumbfounded. And so then when you sit around having a Jolly Rancher, the lesson there is typically like, okay, listen, once something comes out of your mouth, at least the way we talked about it in my class, once something comes out of your mouth, it can't go back in, right? You can't take that away. Put things out there in the ether, it's out there, right? This is Pandora's box in a mythical sense or an allegorical sense, fable type story. This is, now we're moving forward. We're not moving back. We're not going to a college model where athletes don't get paid. That's not happening. I got comments all the time. Oh, back in the day ain't happening. It's not coming back. We're not. It doesn't help to talk about it as if it is, right? Instead, what is this next generation of college athletics, athletes, next iteration of college athletics going to look like, right? That 22 million divided up evenly amongst college athletes at a school, does that incentivize adding programs? Does it decentivize adding programs? Does that number change? How much does the number change? What does that number need? What does that number need to reflect? Right? All these are questions you got to ask as you look at it. And frankly, I don't think that, that's the question. The public just sees the headline: college kids get paid. Woohoo! Right, moving forward. Or, oh my gosh, burn it all down, moving backward. Right. But that's just the first step to all of this. Do you have collective bargaining agreements? Do you have labor strikes? Right? Do you have a free market? Capitalism. Does that mean that 4 programs run the whole thing? Is that different? Right? Like, those are the kinds of questions this leads to. Not, how do we get the athlete? No. Stop asking about taking the money away. It's not going away. Right? The questions this leads to is all with that as a sunk piece, right? Now, honestly, I kind of see both sides of listen, this is college kids. They have a 4-year college career, theoretically. This should be free market capitalism. They should be maximizing the dollars they can make at whatever schools that may be, with whatever sponsorships and NIL deals that may be. They should be maximizing all of that, right? I see that side of the argument, right? Even if I know that hurts the Cougars, and that ultimately hurts me because I like to root for the Cougars. Yes, I understand the logic behind that. I also understand the logic behind, like, they should collectively bargain and make sure that as a workforce, they get XYZ and taken care of like ABC, right? And that adds regulation to things, and that is a boogeyman word as well in a lot of its own rights. I see that too, right? You get a 4-year career in college. You want to make sure it's done right. It doesn't go forever, right? And I don't know where the answers to those questions will be. I don't know where these kinds of things will go. I do know that Houston jumped in this game seemingly right on time, right? Houston gets announced as a Power 5 member in 2021, right? Great feeling, kind of leaked out. It might happen beforehand on some interweb kind of things. And boom, Houston's a Big 12 school as of the 2023-24 school year. And we got a couple years to get ready, and then we're going to jump in, right? If that had been leaked in the summer of 22 for the 2025-26 school year, we might be talking about, never mind. Actually, you're conferenceless. We're going to move forward with this other system, and you weren't here when we started it, so it's really hard to get you included now. Like, Houston signed on right when it was probably the last possible moment to get into all this. And I'd argue that in and of itself is a good thing, right? Because this is the future of college sports. And now it can't happen without us. Whereas feasibly, before, in a not so crazy distant type of timeline, it would. And I think that's important. I think it's important to note. I think it's important to be grateful for, and talk about things to be grateful for, right? That Houston's in, and it's what comes next, not are we gone. Now, I want to talk about this. Obviously, as more comes out, we'll probably do more segments as more information comes out. But big things did just change. It is also a long weekend with Memorial Day on Monday, right? So you want to make sure you follow me at Painsworth 512, PAINSWORTH 512, and all your social media platforms. I'm most active on X and Twitter, if I'm being completely frank with you. But that way we can keep in touch and keep up to date on the latest things happening, as well as my random musings about Houston sports or the NBA playoffs, or losses on sneakers or what have you. So make sure you find me there. Follow me there. Hit subscribe. Hit the bell so you know when we're live as well on YouTube. Locked On Cougs is a prime member of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.